Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hira Amir. I am a project assistant in workforce transformation at OPWDD. Thank you for joining us for this info session. This is a very important info session that has been created for you in response to questions from CCOs and care managers on the front door and service authorization processes. This info session and others that we have delivered are part of OPWDD's ongoing effort to support the transition to health home care management. Just a reminder, this webinar and the associated PowerPoint will be available to you on the OPWDD website. On that website, you will also find all other info sessions that we have presented and recorded for care managers on the life plan, enrollment and consent, CCO health homes, and other important areas. So today we will start with a presentation, and then we will have a question and answer session. So with that, I welcome Sally Berry, the Deputy Director of Regional Offices for OPWDD.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I will mention that all of you probably know you're on mute because of the large number of people who are participating today. So, but we will be taking questions as Grant described earlier through the Q&A. So if you want to submit something, we'll get to those questions later. So I'm joined today also by Deborah Waiver, who will be co-presenting this information on the front door process, and will be sharing information about the process itself. We'll be reviewing some of the materials and forms that are used for as you work your way through the front door process and request services for individuals that you're working with. Some of the things we'll be looking at are the front door process map, which we're actually going to pull up now so we can do a very brief overview. This is a map that we'll be distributing and making available to you later. Some of you may have already seen earlier versions of this, and there's been some tweaking to it. Largely the process as described in this map is the same as some of you might have seen earlier. Just waiting for that to come up on the screen.
We're pulling up the map now, just a second.
Okay, thanks. This map is a slightly abbreviated version of the map that the front door uses to exclude some information that really is very specific to the front door. And we're just going to take a quick look at this now because this is the material that we're actually going to be covering in more detail in the presentation, but we wanted to give you a sense of the front door process in total before we dive into the specifics of each step. So as you can see, there's several steps to the front door. There's this initial contact, which is basic information gathering, getting to know you kind of stuff. Then there's the eligibility and level of care determinations, and we'll talk about the roles and the steps involved with determining eligibility and determining the level of care. The next step in the front door is actually, this is you can pause for a second there, Deborah. This is a little squiggle map that will hopefully be useful for you as a subset of the eligibility and level of care determination to see what happens first and how the process flows. Go ahead. Then the other parts of the front door are the assessment and the review of service needs, and how the front door receives that information and what the CCO does to give us that information and how we process that. And then finally, the confirmation of services and whoops, I got that a little bit backwards there, the waiver enrollment, and then finally the service authorization, and individual then begins the service when they connect with a provider. So again, we'll be going through those steps a little bit more specifically as we walk through the presentation. So some of the things in addition to the map that we're going to be reviewing are the various forms that are used as a part of the process, the TABS ID, the eligibility transmittal form, which is a new form that we'll be making available to you very soon. The level of care eligibility determination form. There's a documentation submission form that needs to accompany most of the documents that are submitted into choices. And then, of course, documents related to the waiver application, which are the application for participation and the documentation of choices. So I mentioned these steps. Let me just review them again. These are the steps that are on the front door process map that will be speaking more specifically about this initial contact part, determining OPWDD eligibility and level of care, the assessment and information gathering. The DDP2 is the assessment that the front door does, and then additional information gathering about preliminary service needs and interests. There's, of course, a big role for the CCO in the middle of this whole process, where the IAM and life plan is developed, and the CCO uses that to assist the individual in identifying services and requesting those services. The waiver application, and then a final review that the front door does about the service requests and whether the waiver enrollment is complete and authorizes services, and then finally the enrollment into services. So those are the basic front door steps. We've defined these in terms of steps, and they are kind of described in a linear fashion, but they really aren't always linear. Some of you who have worked in the front door processes before will realize that there's some back and forth, and some of the steps spill over into other steps, and there's some overlap. But to try and understand it and the different elements of the front door, we've defined it in this step-by-step fashion. So in the initial contact phase of the front door, this is the point at which the front door, as I mentioned, is doing very basic information gathering of the individual. If this individual has not been registered in TABS, some people have, but if that hasn't happened, then we will do a TABS registration. We check on the status of Medicaid, on OPWDD eligibility, of course, whether the level of care has been determined, and what the need is for care management, which would then direct whether the person most likely is going to be looking for waiver services and would, of course, be connecting with the CCOs. We provide information about the CCOs at this phase of the front door. We have handouts that we'll give to individuals and families about the CCOs that exist in their communities. As you all know, there are CCOs that function in across the state in different counties. So the information that we provide for people gives them contact and information geographically about where those CCOs provide services. And we also have in the front door the eligibility assessment and authorization tool, the EAA, and that's our tracking system. So when somebody comes to this initial contact part of the front door and we know they're looking for services, we will open the EAA tracking tool and begin recording information, which follows the process all the way through to service authorization. Now, somebody comes to the front door in a couple of different ways. They may have already, as was the case in the MSC world, an individual in the family might have already made contact with the CCO and have begun to connect with them and maybe have done some work with them. In those cases, the CCO pretty early in that contact will be referring the person to the front door to begin the front door process. Some people won't have yet connected to the CCO, will come directly to the front door first, and as I mentioned, we'll be providing information about CCOs and contact information, registering them for a TABS ID if that's necessary. The role of the TABS ID is a critical piece for the CCO staff. This is the piece that allows, having the TABS ID for an individual that you're working with is what allows you to begin to connect to choices and upload information into choices. So there's a process, which we'll talk a little bit more in detail about how you request that TABS ID and how we then transmit it to you. There's a special form, and information is traded really between the CCO and the front door about on that form. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The initial contact phase from the perspective, I guess, of the CCO staff includes, when necessary, assisting individuals and their families with documentation gathering for eligibility, for LCED, and for Medicaid. And early on, if the individual hasn't yet participated in an OPWDD front door information session, we ask that the CCO staff refer the person to the front door so we can schedule that session, encouraging people to attend that session as early in the process as possible. And most services can't be authorized until that session has been completed. So the TABS ID part, again, there's and Deborah, I think, is going to show you the forms that are paper forms. Some are in choices and can't really be viewed later on. But the TABS ID, it's called the Request for TABS ID and Transmittal Form for Determination of Developmental Disability. So this, again, is what enables you to upload documents using a documentation submission form. And when the documents are submitted in choices, which it happens frequently throughout the process, then the CCO staff notifies the front door staff that they're there via an email, and they're waiting for review. By the same token, the front door staff will be checking their queues and choices on a regular basis to ensure that they're staying on top of what's been submitted. So between those two communications, notification by the CCO to the front door and the front door staff checking the queues, then hopefully the documents and information will be readily reviewed. And now I'm going to turn it over to Deborah to talk about OPWDD eligibility and a little bit more about the process to use the forms that I mentioned.
Okay, to start, this process here with the eligibility has changed somewhat from what you've known in the past. So the CCO staff will upload the eligibility supporting documentations to choices. But as Sally has mentioned, in order to do any uploading into choices, you have to have the TABS ID number. I'm just going to go out of this screen right now and pull up that form that we've been talking about that needs to be completed, section 1 and 2, that requests the TABS ID number. So this is the new form. The form used to be entitled Eligibility Transmittal Form, but since we are using this form twofold now, we're using it for the CCOs to request the TABS ID and also for the determination of developmental disability. So here we have this form that's titled Request for TABS ID and Transmittal Form for Determination of Developmental Disability. Section 1 and 2 are the two sections that CCOs should complete when requesting the TABS ID. Now, we know that without a TABS ID, you cannot upload in the choices, so this form will have to be transmitted or sent over to the DDRO via email, and the communication back from the DDRO will be to the contact person that's identified in Section 2 on this form. So I will go back to the slide. So the CCO staff will upload that information, but prior to uploading, please review the eligibility important facts. There has been some updates to that important facts, and we want to ensure that when you upload the documents into choices that this package is complete and sufficient, that it includes the necessary evaluations that is required for eligibility determination. For example, the psychological and the medical and the social evaluations. Just to make mention, it has been a process, or it is right now in process, the streamlining of LCED and eligibility. So the documentations that are going to be submitted for eligibility will also be used for LCED. But in order to upload into choices, you should be completing the documentation submission form. The documentation submission form is actually housed in choices. So the care manager or the intake worker at the CCO will complete the documentation submission form. The documentation submission form is really like a cover page of what you're going to be uploading. What documentations are you going to be following that submission with by uploading the specific documents? So you upload those documents into choices. You need to use the naming conventions. You can review the CCO documentation submission user guide. It speaks to how to create this form and the various naming conventions that is associated with the document that you will be submitting and how to make that link. You upload the completed request for tabs ID, what you saw just now, because remember now when you're completing it at first, you're only completing section 1 and 2 to request the tabs ID. But in order to have the eligibility determined, you need to complete their entire form. So what you're going to be uploading is all the supporting documentation that's required for eligibility, the completed request for tabs ID and transmittal form, and also completing that documentation submission form and choices. Then we ask that you notify the front door staff that there are documents waiting for review. OPWDD staff reviews the eligibility documents and then issue a notice of eligibility notice of determination, or also known as eligibility letter. So once the eligibility is determined, OPWDD eligibility is determined, the evaluation documents are reviewed to determine the level of care. You will upload whatever additional information is needed for the LCED, but basically the only additional information that will be needed is the review and sign-off on the LCED form of the physician. So the physician will sign off on that LCED form. Now, this process varies depending upon the availability of a state physician. If the DDRO uses the service of a state physician to sign the LCED form, front door will complete the entire form, the LCED form, have the physician review it and sign off, and then we will upload it into choices into the supporting documentations. Now, if a state physician is not available or they don't have that resource available to them, then the CCO staff will be responsible to getting that LCED form signed off by a community doctor utilizing community resources. Now, what will happen is that LCED form will be initiated by the DDRO. We will begin that process. We will then forward it over to the CCO. CCO will then go and assist the individual by securing that physician's signature in the community. Once the physician has signed off, CCO will upload that document into choices using the documentation submission form and notify staff that that document is waiting for review. Once we receive that document, we will have the DDRO staff sign off, the designated staff sign off on that, and we will then upload it into supporting documents and notify the CCO. So once the LCED is determined, DDRO staff must complete the level of care date transmittal form. This form transmits the level of care effective date to tabs. So DDRO will be doing that for the initial LCED, and the CCO will be doing the LCED date transmittal form for redetermination. This form is also housed in choices. So it's only two things that will be put on this form. It's basically the LCED date, and then also the CCO will also be populated onto that form. Now we move on to the LCED and waiver documents. Basically, since the LCED has moved up further into this process, whereas in the past, LCED was completed at the time of waiver. Now we're completing the LCED at the same time of eligibility, so in actuality, the majority of the waiver packet will be completed earlier on. So if an individual is pursuing waiver, the evaluation documents collected for the OPWDD and eligibility are used. Also, you have the application of participation and the documentation of choice. So if you're working with an individual who has expressed interest in waiver service, Then at the same time where you have completed and had the physician sign off on that LCED form, you can actually have the individual sign the application for participation in the documentation of choice form. And you can upload those two documents as well with the signed LCED form into choices using the naming convention. Now, once we have those forms, the front door staff can request a letter of introduction from our revenue support based on the LCED. The LCED are uploaded into choices, as I mentioned, utilizing the documentation submission form. CCO enrollment can occur. Just to reiterate, we all know that in order to be enrolled into a CCO, you need three things to be satisfied. You need to have your OPWDD eligibility confirmed, the level of care determined, and Medicaid obtained. To enroll an individual in the CCO, staff must submit the completed CCO1 enrollment form in choices. It has to be submitted. What happens sometimes is that people will complete it and then save it. You must submit it, and then that process, you should look for any messages or errors or warnings after you submit it to ensure that it was successfully submitted. I'm going to turn it back over to Sally. Sally.
Anything for her?
Sally?
Sorry, I was on mute. I said a lot of really important things just in the past 30 seconds. So I wanted to mention a couple of things that Deborah referenced. The TABS ID and eligibility form that we've mentioned a couple of times, that form is in the final stages of development as we speak. So even though it's a form in a different version that you're familiar with, the modified, updated form will be ready within the next few business days. So we'll distribute that and make that available to you. Also, Deborah mentioned the user guide. When we'll talk about, we'll provide a link later in the PowerPoint to that user guide. That has been distributed to people, both front door and to CCOs, so it's the Choices user guide. If you haven't seen it, then make sure you try and secure it because it's an important tool and guidance document for you. And then finally, we talked about the LCED date being entered into choices and then transmitted to tabs after the front door staff enters that. And the reason that we're emphasizing that and it's so important is that is what Deborah was talking about in terms of what's required for enrollment. And if there isn't an indication in tabs that the person has the level of care eligibility determination needed, then the CCO enrollment will be rejected. There'll be an error code, and you won't be able to process that enrollment at that time. So just a couple more informational pieces. So now we've gone through the initial contact piece, we've worked on eligibility, we've started talking about and the level of care. There's some discussions that have been going on about preliminarily at least what services might be needed and developed. And this is the point at which the front door then does a review, an assessment of the person's status and needs as of the current time anyway by filling out and conducting the DDP-2. We'll update that if one already exists and it doesn't seem to match the person any longer, or we'll create one new if that's needed. And at the same time, we're getting a general sense of the individual service needs. We're identifying any immediate needs that have to be acted on sooner rather than later if that hasn't become obvious yet. We're also assessing and making appropriate internal referrals. If somebody is interested in a certified residential setting, we would refer to the front door CCRO team in each district. If they're looking for the care at home waiver, if that's something they want to pursue. And then, of course, we've already talked a bit about waiver services. by now we should have a pretty clear understanding of whether it is waiver services that they're looking for and the sort of more robust services that would provide them, or if they're looking for something a little less intense and perhaps they want only family support services or the ISS housing subsidy, which those of you who are familiar with the front door, that's now kind of in a fast track piece within the front door process. There's no need for people who are only looking for those services to go through the waiver application, et cetera, so we can skip a couple of steps and authorize those services sooner rather than later. And then, so the front door has done the work, and the CCO has done the work that we've described so far, and this is the point in the process where the CCO is beginning to dive into the needs of the individual, the service, beginning the conversation about service development. The person has been enrolled, so you can look at developing the IM and the life plan. If the person hasn't quite been officially enrolled, because I think everyone knows that the enrollment occurs the beginning of the month following when the paperwork, so to speak, has been processed. So people might be interacting with the CCO intake worker or the CCO care manager at this point, and interacting, of course, with the front door at this point, but the person may not be officially enrolled. And it's our understanding that you can't access yet the IT tools to create the IM and the life plan until after that enrollment occurs. And again, that would happen at the beginning of the following month. So, however, once that does happen, then the CCO, again, either the intake worker or now I think the care manager would be involved, will be developing the IM and the life plan and fleshing out those service needs. And as that happens, then the service request for service authorization gets created, which is listing the items that are identified on the life plan that the person needs to support them. And the request for service authorization also has a new piece to it that, if you're familiar with that form, we've added a section that allows for a 1 or 2 sentence at most description and justification for the services that are being requested. People can also attach information to that form, and of course we are looking for what at this point would be a draft life plan to be submitted with the request for service authorization. So the front door, having the knowledge from the DDP2 and whatever interactions they've had with the individual, the draft life plan, the request for service authorization with some information on it, all of that will be what's needed to help the front door make informed decisions about service authorizations. We're also at this point looking for, if waiver services are being pursued, we're making sure that those appropriate documents that Deborah reviewed, the application and participation documentation of choices, are included. Remember, we already have the documents that support the LCED, which, as Deborah mentioned, used to be housed with the waiver application, is now at the beginning of the process. But those documents, the medical, the social, the psychological, those same documents that are used for eligibility are the ones that inform the LCED and have already been reviewed.
Sally, before you move forward, I want to bring up the request for service authorization form.
Okay.
So this is the request for service authorization form. As Sally mentioned, you see the second section, well, underneath requested service, we have explanation of need for service. So we're not asking for a lot of information there, but we're asking that you document the need for that service that you indicated above. Now, you can make reference to, if you're utilizing the draft life plan, you can make reference to the section in the life plan that may speak to the documentation, why there's a need for that service. So we just added that to this form. This form will be published hopefully within the next few days. We had to do some change, make some little minor changes, but it should be available to you within the next few days. Now, in addition, Sally, I'm going to bring up the application for participation, which everyone is familiar with. Nothing has changed with that form. I think this form will have some changes made to it because it still referenced service coordinator and also the documentation of choices form. So these are the forms that those that have been doing MSC in the past should be very familiar with. So Sally, I will pass it back over to you.
Okay. All right, so again, we've referenced this already. The front door looks at the request for service authorization, compares it to the information in the draft life plan, which has been uploaded into choices by the CCO worker. And the life plan, again, has a description of and reasons for the service request. And we also look at how that aligns with the DDP2. If there's services that are requested that just don't seem to be existing anywhere in any of these reference materials that we have, then we'll be in touch. The front door would connect with the CCO worker and have a discussion, get clarification about any questions that need to be answered. So after the services are authorized, or actually right before the final official service authorization, the front door has an internal review process to make sure that everything looks like it should. We also, at this point in the stage in the process, make sure that the enrollment to the CCO has occurred and that Medicaid, the right Medicaid is in place. We look at the waiver package. This is the time at which we would produce the waiver NOD, and we would send that to the individual and the family and the service coordinator, and advance the service request to the RO director for final sign-off, and then we would send the service authorization letter and, the waiver. This is where we send the waiver NOD to the individual family and care manager. And that is effectively the end of the front door process. The next step is enrollment into services, which is facilitated, of course, by the CCO, who is assisting the individual in determining what providers to choose, what providers are available, and the providers then are submitting the DDP-1s to enroll the person into services. So now Deborah's going to do a review of whatever forms we haven't already talked about. I think you've got them all, though, Deborah, right?
Yes, I'm looking at the list.
All
but
right.
I can go
again,
go ahead.
I was just saying a couple of these are still getting some final touches, but should be available to you very soon.
Yes, and just to reiterate about creating these forms and choices and navigating through choices to create these forms. The new forms and choices you can create just as you have created in the past. You navigate through the main screen and you can do a tabs ID lookup. Or if in fact the individual is already enrolled in the CCO, where you have access then to the individual's record, you can actually go to their individual profile screen and also complete the form. The documentation submission form, we cannot say enough about that user guide. Here is a link for that user guide. This user guide walks you through the whole process. Now, in the documentation submission guide, it is used for two purposes here. You have for eligibility and LCED, and you use it for the request for service authorization. So you have two reasons for submission in the documentation submission form. One is eligibility, as I mentioned, one is service authorization. For eligibility, you will upload all the supporting documentations that's required for eligibility determination and LCED. Now, what you have to do first is complete this form and submit it. And then once this form is completed and submitted in Choices, you can upload the supporting documents. The other reason for submission by using this documentation submission form is service authorization. So that reason will be used for the request for service authorization, uploading the life plan, and also you can use this at a later time if you had a service amendment. The documentation submission form has two statuses, just like most forms now in Choices. You have active or inactive. Active means that that form is still available for editing. You can save it, and you can open it, you can save it again, and then you can submit it. But once it's submitted, once the form is submitted, then it shows up on the DDRO queue. Then they will know that it's something waiting for them. So if you just enter the form into Choices, you uploaded information, but you just saved it and you did not submit, it will not show up on our queue. You have to submit it, and then it will show up. But we also ask that you notify us that it has been submitted. We at the DDRO, they will be monitoring that queue on a regular basis, but it's just out of courtesy. If you can just notify us that you have uploaded information into Choices, we'll know that it's materials there waiting for our review. The inactive status of the documentation submission form means that it was completed out. So what DDRO staff will go onto the queue and click on a button to complete it. What that will do, one of two things. It will remove it from the queue if in fact it's still existing in the queue, or then it will also append it to the supporting documents. And once it's inactive, there's no more changes that can be made to that form. The service amendment, as we mentioned before, I think that's your part, Sally.
Right. So the service amendment, again, no change in the service amendment. This is the process by which someone requests new services or a change in services by individuals who are already receiving OPWDD services. So that process remains the same, and the service amendment form is submitted by the care manager to the RO.
But you can submit that service amendment form in Choices. It cannot be completed in Choices. That's not a form that's housed in Choices. Just like the request for service authorization is not housed in Choices. You can complete it outside of Choices, but upload it into Choices just using their correct reason for submission, which would be service authorization. And just to make mention, the service amendment form is still in its final process to we're making some edits, so that should be available as well very soon.
Right, and we have and will continue to distribute the CCO front door contacts for CCOs. Those have been circulated previously, and I know that there have been additional contacts made kind of on a local level that people are finding useful. So we'll provide that contact list if people need it additionally. And I think we're at the discussion and questions time. I don't know, Deborah, if you're going to pause and look at questions, then we can loop back to people, put them on hold for a couple minutes.
Yes, we can pause and look at questions, and then we'll come back.
Okay, I'm going to place the phone on mute, and please wait while we look at the questions.
Yeah.
you want me to read the question? Okay. Question. It sounds like the front door is doing the initial IM and life plan.
The answer to that is, go ahead, Sally.
Yeah, the CCOs are the ones doing the IM and life plan. The front door is doing the DDP2, and the CCO care manager will ultimately be developing the IM and the life plan.
Yes. Do the CCOs process the applications or recertifications for Medicaid, or just assist in getting information for submitting?
The CCOs just assist in gathering the information required for Medicaid.
And in some instances, this is Angie Francis, in some instances the care manager will actually help the individual complete the entire Medicaid application, initial or the recertification.
Will we use the same eligibility form to request permanent eligibility for those who currently have provisional?
Yes. You will request eligibility for those that currently have provisional, and when the time is up and you need to request for eligibility, you will use the form that is in exist that we spoke about earlier, the tabs ID, yes, in the same process.
Will the new transmittal form be available on the OPWDD website to download?
Yes.
Which transmittal form are they talking about?
The new one, right?
The one with the giant long name?
Oh.
The tabs ID and eligibility transmittal.
Yeah, because we also have an LCED transmittal form.
Right, that's true.
Yeah.
So will they both be available? Or
they both will be available. We would like to house them on our website. Yeah, go ahead.
What about individuals that went through front door process prior to CCO starting? What process would be followed?
You know, this is a question that's come up a couple of times that we probably can't answer all the nuances of, but so we are working, and I was working on guidance actually this morning to ship out to people as soon as we can. The basic answer is that there's sort of two populations that fit in that already working with the front door population. There are individuals who were at the front door, working their way through it, already working with an MSC. Those individuals should have been transitioned to CCOs, and the CCO workers would kind of pick up where the front door process left off or the MSC left off. There most likely, in those cases, would have been a PISP developed, and the PISP is valid in those cases until later on the life plan is developed, but the CCOs can be working from that. So again, more details will develop these scenarios for you. The other group are individuals who didn't get very far in the front door process and would not have been connected to an MSC. So those individuals, front door should be referring them or might have already referred them to a CCO so that they can make that connection. And again, the CCO in the front door, then depending on where that person is in the process, will pick up the work and continue on. But I realize there's variations of that. You know, somebody who's already got the waiver application and somebody who doesn't, and et cetera. So we're going to try and parse those out for you so it's clearer as to who does what when someone was already partway through the process.
If the DDRO is completing the LCED, I would assume that they are gathering the supporting physical, writing the social history for level of care, and gathering the psychological.
I'm sorry, say that one more time, Emily.
Sure. If the DDRO is completing the LCED, the writer assumes that they are gathering the supporting physical, writing the social history for level of care, and gathering the psychological.
Well, those are the documents, most of those are the documents that we're asking that are also involved with eligibility determination. So those are the documents that will have been gathered sometimes by the individual and family. If not, then it's the CCOs largely who will be assisting with gathering those documents.
Right, and I just want to add to that, Sally. I'm not sure if the question is asking, because remember we had mentioned that if a state physician is available, that the DDRO completes that LCED form and uploads it. However, we complete the form. The gathering of the information is still the responsibility of the CCO to assist the individual in getting that information together.
What do we do with individuals who are enrolled in a CCO but not seeking waiver enrollment? Will they now need an LCED?
Yes. For CCO enrollment, a level of care determination is required. The person does not have to receive waiver service to be enrolled in the CCO, but you have to be enrolled in the CCO. You need the OPWDD eligibility, you need Medicaid, and you need level of care.
Can intake coordinators that are employed by voluntary agencies still submit for eligibility and obtain LCEDs?
It's the responsibility of the CCOs to do that.
Yep.
Are we required now to submit annual redetermination of level of care to the DDRO, or can we just review and sign as we currently do?
And I guess currently do means pre-7/1. You are required to submit the redetermination of the level of care. You will be completing that level of care form. You will be uploading that form into Choices, and you will also be responsible for redeterminations to complete the LCED transmittal form, which transmit that effective date into tabs.
Can I just chime in? And the reason for that is, as Deb stated, to be enrolled in the CCO, you must have level of care eligibility. Therefore, those redetermination dates must be uploaded into Choices so that as the rosters are done each month for CCOs, we know who is eligible for the CCO. That is why there's a change with the uploading of redetermination dates into Choices.
Will the initial LCED be good for more than 30 days?
Yes, the initial LCED is good for 365 days.
What is
and so
redetermination?
Yeah, annual.
What is the email address we should use to submit the request for tabs information?
You should contact your DDRO. I believe Sally did provide contact information for the local DDROs to the CCO agencies. So if you can ask someone in your agency, they will have the information as far as individual names, emails, telephone numbers, because that's your first piece of official communication between the front door and the CCO to request that tabs ID number. So that's a part of, that's communication that's not going to be done through Choices.
Will CCO staff still need to complete their own DDP-2 for the waiver packet, or can the DDP-2 that was completed by the front door worker be used?
Yes. Yes, it could be used.
Whichever.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Can the LOI be issued prior to the development of a life plan?
Yes. If the individual is seeking parental deeming, the LOI has to be submitted prior to the life plan, because we hope that the individual should have Medicaid. So that's the whole process of moving the LCD further up and having the application of participation and the documentation of choices completed at that point. No longer will you have the PIS. I know a lot of the areas and regions and districts have been using the PIS in the past to help them with the Medicaid, obtaining Medicaid for parental deeming. So now you will have the level of care determination and plus those other documents that substantiate that this person is waiver eligible and is seeking a waiver service.
If LCED is being done at the time of eligibility, will there be a time frame in order to get the physician to sign the LCED?
Will there be
I don't know. I don't think I understand the question.
I think it's asking if there's going to be some cutoff, a time limit, in order before you can to get the physician's signature.
This is Kate. I think the issue would be that until all of that is done, the waiver enrollment process cannot be completed. The LCED cannot be completed. So
CCO enrollment cannot be.
So right. So it's not, you know, it's required to be done prior to moving forward to the next step.
Right.
Right.
Oh, yes, right. It's CCO enrollment, not waiver enrollment for the last part, whereas you definitely need the LC, what was the question? Yeah, so that needs to be done in a timely manner as far as the LCED and the physician sign-off prior to enrollment into CCO. You cannot be enrolled in the CCO without the LCED.
So I think that covered most of the questions that were provided, and we'll be able to take a look at any questions that didn't get answered and think of another forum for completing those questions and answers, as we've been doing with questions that have come in through the implementation mailbox and the CCO mailbox. But I think our time is up for today. We appreciate so many people participating. I know we had 1,000 people registered for this call. And as was stated in the beginning, this will be available for your reference as a taped training available on the website in the very close future. So thank you all for your participation.
Thank you.